So we're going to start talking about the self-advocacy days. So in the 70s, 1974 to be specific, People First Conference is held in Oregon, and this really starts the self-advocacy. It starts getting people riled up and starts talking about civil rights of individuals with an intellectual disability. A couple hundred people attended this conference, and it allowed them as individuals with intellectual disability to actually be heard. This is the first phase of self-advocacy in the United States. There are other countries that actually, before 1974, were already starting the self-advocacy days in their history and were already fighting for the rights. So this movement redefined the disability problem. It was less about fixing the issue and more about being viewed and treated like an equal. Next, we're going to talk about IDEA. So in 1975, Education for All Handicapped Children Act, now called IDEA, is passed. This means that all schools are to provide full educational opportunities to children with disabilities. Now let's go back in our history. PA was the first state and 4 years ahead of the curve. You know, they started offering full education because of the civil lawsuit that was filed and won by Park. So now the rest of the United States is following suit. So this new act required all federally funded schools to have free education to all children. The children had to have education in the least restrictive setting possible, and all children had to have an IEP, which is an individual education program. So these children were actually being segregated before this. You know, they weren't given any education, or they were given unfair education. So now IDEA, which was called Education for All Handicapped Children Act before, is now offering these educational opportunities for these children, which was a huge, huge thing in the United States. So now we're going to start talking about the 1980s into the 1990s. In 1981, there is a movie that is released called Bill. We'll talk about that more in detail. In 1987, Willowbrook, which we discussed on the previous slides, is finally closed. In 1990, ADA is passed, and we'll talk about that more further as well. In order to talk about the movie Bill, we have to talk about Bill Sackter. Bill was born in 1913 to Russian immigrants in Minnesota. When his father had a heart attack, his mother could not keep up with the demands of the family, and so Bill, who had a learning disability, or so they thought, was placed in an institution. He resided in the institution Faribault School for the Feeble-Minded and Epileptic from the age of 7 to 51. That's 44 years in the institution. While at the institution and when he first got there, he was wrongly diagnosed as moderately intellectually disabled. He actually was mild. He was released in 1964 because that's when people started doing more evaluations and assessments to see who could independently live on their own. Bill was one of those individuals. He was put into a halfway house. Bill became a handyman at a local country club where he actually met Mero. Barry becomes one of his best friends. Barry takes Bill under his wing. Eventually, Barry then becomes Bill's guardian and moves him to Iowa. Why this happens, in a little tidbit, Bill became sick and wasn't taking care of himself while living in the halfway house and out in the community, and the state of Minnesota was going to make him go back into an institution. And Barry was really good friends with Bill at the time and really didn't want that to happen, so Barry became Bill's guardian. Whenever they moved to Iowa, Barry is a professor at the University of Iowa, and he allows Bill to get a job at the same university and really pushes him to be his own boss. So Bill owns his own business on campus, and it's a coffee shop. So Bill, serves coffee in the mornings to the students and to other professors, and he plays the harmonica, and everyone ends up really loving Bill, and he actually retires from the coffee shop. The 1981 movie Bill is released after they made it, and Mickey Rooney plays Bill. He actually wins an Emmy and a Golden Globe for his performance. If you want to see more information about Bill Sackter, there is the movie Bill, as well as there are 2 documentaries that you can watch about Bill Sackter and his relationship with Barry Mero. But it was like the first propaganda that showed someone with an intellectual disability in a positive light. Next, we're going to talk about ADA. In 1990, Americans with Disability Act, or ADA, is passed as a civil rights law. This civil rights law protects individuals with a disability from discrimination. This is any disability. It is not just an intellectual disability. It also helps those with a disability with getting the same rights and opportunities as others. So there's 5 different titles that we'll be talking about. Title 1 is employment. So that just means that anybody with a disability should have equal employment opportunities. There's more that kind of goes into that as well: equal wages, equal accommodations at work, and workplace accommodations for those with a disability. Title 2 is state and local government or services, and this just says that anybody with a disability should have the right to help in the community. So anybody that needs help getting a shower or going to the bathroom or taking care of themselves, or maybe a job coach, that's really where these things come into play. ADA is fighting for those rights. Title 3 is public accommodations, and this is kind of where we see the more physical accommodations. So, the ramps that go into buildings, the parking lots with accessibility, as well as the parking lots with the handicapped spaces. This also kind of plays into like hearing loss and deaf, so interpreter services, as well as having the Braille for signs, and, just accommodations that anybody would need out in public. Title 4 is telecommunications, so this kind of goes into a little bit more of hearing loss and deaf again, where they talk about, people with disabilities should have the same rights to use the telephone. So this is where we see the interpreters and, phones that are accessible to individuals with a disability. Title 5 is anything that kind of doesn't fit, kind of gets into this miscellaneous, and it also was amended in 2008 to add more disabilities to the law to further include individuals that weren't included before. Home and community-based services starts in the 1980s, and in order to talk about home and community-based services, we have to talk about Katie Beckett. So Katie Beckett at 5 months old was actually diagnosed with a brain inflammation and went into a coma. She came out of the coma with a lot of issues. She had respiratory issues as well as partial paralysis. She spent the next 2.5 years living in a hospital hooked up to a ventilator to help her breathe. And that was a really long time for her parents, and a lot of the hospital staff took really good care of Katie, but her parents really wanted her at home. And so President Ronald Reagan actually started to put the motion in to get Katie to go home. Her parents were great advocates for her, and they really wanted her to go home. So they contacted their local legislators as well as their state and federal legislators, and eventually President Ronald Reagan caught wind of it. So he actually put in place that Katie would go home because it actually costs less to be kept at home instead of the hospital, and it's actually 1/6 to be exact. So after Ronald Reagan does this, he gets the brilliant idea for home and community-based services, which is actually what we call a waiver program. So in 1981, he passes the Home and Community-Based Services Program, and this service helps keep people at home, not in institution or residentials. So there is actually a waiver under Home and Community-Based Services that's called, still to this day, Katie Beckett waiver, and it helps children under the age of 19 with services. And Katie Beckett ended up staying at home with her parents until her death. but she had a better quality of life staying at home with them. So now we talk about today. So self-advocacy is still around, but it becomes really popular in the 90s. People with intellectual disabilities start to rally together and fight for what they believe in. So we see a lot more rallies on, like Harrisburg steps and legislator doors. The most recent one that we saw that was really, really cool, we'll talk about in our present day. The National Association for Retarded Citizens is now changed to ARC in 1991. In the 2000s, most institutions are now being closed, and inclusion is encouraged for those with a disability. In 2010, mental retardation is now changed to intellectual disability or developmental disability. And then present, there are state laws that change every day and acts being amended to further include those with a disability. And we've made amazing strides. There are movements, especially in Pennsylvania, like Everyday Lives and Person-Centered Thinking, which we discuss in the rest of the training. But these are movements that are super important to individuals that have an intellectual disability and really having their voice heard. There was a rally not long ago where, they were on Harrisburg steps saying, I can't have anything done for me. I need to do it myself. So their rally cry was "Nothing about me without me," which was really cool. Another thing that they just did recently, and actually it was in 2019, was they had a social media rally. So they took over Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, and they had a lot of their advocates, friends, family members really hitting the legislators' social media pretty hard. What they're fighting for right now is fair wages for their direct care workers. So they want people that are helping them every day to get paid fairly, which is really cool. So that is the end of our training on history of dual diagnosis. The next 3 slides are going to be references. If you want to look up any more information on the things that we talked about, I highly encourage that.